excelente. Bueno, pues damos paso a la presentación del libro Derecho, Argumentación y Ponderación, ensayos en honor al profesor Robert Alexi. En la moderación estarán el profesor Arnulfo Mateos, Gonzalo Villarrosas también. Y bueno, tenemos la presencia de académicos del más alto nivel de distintos países: Italia, Austria, Estados Unidos, China, Brasil, Alemania, Argentina, España. Así que bienvenidos sean todos ustedes y pues les cedo entonces la moderación de este trabajo a nuestros queridos amigos Arnulfo y Gonzalo. Muchísimas gracias.
So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the presentation of the book Law, Argumentation and Balancing, Essays in Honor of Robert Alexi, published by Universidad Externada de Colombia in 2023. Although this book was published in Spanish, today's presentation will be in English. This reflects the international impact of Robert Alexi's work. Robert Alexi's contributions stands out for the wide range of topics they address and the unique way they approach these issues. His work combines philosophical depth, analytical precision, and real-world applicability in the field of law. What makes his work even more remarkable is its scope and systematic nature. Perhaps for these reasons, few contemporary philosophical works have had such a significant influence, not only on theoretical debates, but also on constitutional jurisprudence in Europe and Latin America. Our book offers a critical approach to Alexi's work, bringing together contributions from leading scholars across diverse cultural and legal traditions. The authors come from North and South America, Asia, and Europe, reflecting a truly global perspective. The book is structured into 12 chapters, divided in 3 sections: the nature of law and the claim to correctness, theory of legal argumentation, and theory of principles and balancing. These sections are organized by the level of abstraction, ranging from general topics in the philosophy of law to more concrete issues in constitutional law. The title of our book, Law, Argumentation and Balancing, reflects this structure. It also echoes the triadic architecture of Alexi's thought, grounded in 3 fundamental works. First, The Argument from Injustice, a reply to legal positivism, published by Oxford in 2002, translated by Bonnie-Lichevsky Paulson and Stanley L. Paulson. Second, The Theory of Legal Argumentation, published by Oxford in 1998, translated by Ruth Adler and Neil McCormick, and A Theory of Constitutional Rights, published in Oxford by Oxford in 2002, translated by Julian Rivers. The first section of our book focuses on nature of law and the claim to correctness. It includes the following chapters. First, Alexi and Kelsen on legal validity by Stanley L. Paulson. Second, Robert Alexi, Bradbuck's Formula and the Nature of Legal Theory by Brian Bix. Third, Non-Positivism and the Weakening Need for the Separation of Law and Morality, Reflections on the Debate between Robert Alexi and Joseph Raz, written by Feng. Fourth, The Claim to Correctness in Robert Alexi's Thought, the necessary formulation for the claim to correctness by law and the necessary connection between law and morality, written by Claudia Toledo. And fifth, The Claim to Correctness and the Moral Limits of Law, written by Alejandro Nava Tovar. The second section is dedicated to Alexi's theory of legal argumentation and includes the following chapters. What does arguing legal decisions mean? 9 theses by Carsten Bäcker. The dual nature of law, the dual nature of rule of law, written by Matthias Klatt. Tovar, a complementary theory of legal argumentation, dismantling gender stereotypes, written by Laura Clerico and Martín Aldao. The third section focuses on Alexi's theory of principles and balancing, featuring these chapters. Robert Alexi theory of principles, some notes, and its interpretation by Noelia Martinez Doalo, Alexis theory of principles, written by Jan-Reinard Zygmunt, Robert Alexis reconstruction of the general right to equality, written by Martin Bochowski, the conflict of norms in debate, Friedrich Müller and Robert Alexi, written by Natalina Stamili. Our book also includes a list of Robert Alexis publications up to 2023. To continue, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Arnulfo Mateos, who will introduce today's speakers. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for being with us this day. And today we will start with Professor Brian Biggs. He's professor at the University of Minnesota. Professor Brian Biggs, whenever you want, you can start.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay. It's a great honor to be included in this wonderful volume and to be associated even in this very small and indirect way with the work of Robert Alexi. He's a scholar of massive importance in a variety of fields, as has already been explained. There are many speakers to get through, so I will keep to my time limit and perhaps even shorter than that. My article, as already noted, was Robert Alexi, Radbruch's Formula and the Nature of Legal Theory, which was first published in the Rechtstheorie. And we start with Gustav Radbruch, who introduced his formula, indeed two versions of his formula, but I will focus on the better known one that stated that law that was sufficiently unjust lost its status as law. This version of Radbruch's formula, or something like it, was used by the German courts in the 1940s and 1950s, dealing with some Nazi laws after World War II, and was again used some decades later by the West German courts, or now fully unified German courts, dealing with some of East German laws and East German actions. In turn, Robert Alexi endorsed Radbruch's formula and made it the centerpiece of his anti-positivist theory of law, combining the formula with his own correctness thesis. And I understand we will hear a number of discussions of this correctness thesis. The correctness thesis, speaking roughly, is the argument that to be legal, an individual norm or system of norms must claim correctness. And ones which did not succeed in being correct, in the sense of morally correct, legitimate, would be defective as law. My article raised some general inquiries and some possible objections. And of course, we don't have time to go into them at any length here. By the way, maybe I will, people who want to discuss this further, I will put my email into the chat. I'm happy to follow up to discuss this article and related matters, but briefly, one point I raised was that Radbruch formula was too often understood, or I believe improperly understood, as a theory of the nature of law, or as essentially connected with a theory of the nature of law, that it was, but in fact, that it is best understood primarily as a theory of adjudication, a theory of how courts should respond to particular types of sources when deciding individual cases. And while some theories of the nature of law have implications for theories of adjudication, famously, Dworkin argued that his theory had implications for deciding particular cases. Scott Shapiro has argued that his theory has implications for some cases. But these connections need to be shown. They can't just be assumed. And many theorists, perhaps most prominently Joseph Ross, have made a point of emphasizing that their theory of the nature of law does not depend on or have implications for the resolution of particular disputes by the courts. Secondly, that Alexi's claim of correctness, to the extent it is persuasive, is so not because it makes a valid observation about the nature of law, I argue, but because it is built on a general observation about any sort of claim or affirmation, that it is, as I argued at greater length in the paper, it's a point about language and rhetoric, not a point about law and morality. And third, on its own terms, the claim of correctness, I argued, is simply not persuasive. And I'm following some ideas, related ideas were put forward by Matthew Kramer, amongst others. I gave in the paper a hypothetical example of a country whose constitution stated the following. Alexei has his own hypothetical. His hypothetical is a country that has a constitution that says this is an unjust republic. My hypothetical, the Constitution says, we have no time for so-called justice. That is the talk of weak countries. Our country is all about commercial efficiency and doing the best we can for the citizens of our great nation. This country does not claim correctness, at least not correctness in the way Alexei says they must, to qualify as law. But in my hypothetical, I see no reason to withhold the label of law from that country. So partly I'm interested in how best to understand Radbruch's formula, again, not its merits, but whether it should be understood primarily as a theory of adjudication or as Alexei seems to understand it, more essentially connected with a theory of the nature of law. And then I also take on raise some doubts about the nature of Alexei's own claim to correctness, which, as I said, we'll be hearing probably at greater length and by better sources in later talks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Brian Biggs. That was a very interesting presentation. Now, our next speaker is Professor Feng. He's professor at the China University of Political Science and Law. He's here, but we are gonna present a video he made before, so we will start the video now.
In his reply to Robert Alexei, Ratz raised at least three interesting criticisms, including first, the ambiguity of legal theory in the positivistic tradition, second, the indeterminate formulations of the separation thesis, and third, the necessary claim of law to legitimate authority as a moral claim. I will argue that Ratz's three criticisms are misleading, since he even acknowledges that, I quoted, they are conceptually necessary collections between law and morality, which no legal positivist has any reason to deny, quote ended. Actually, Ratz prefers the legal theory in positivistic tradition rather than legal positivism. He grants only the common core of the positivist tradition, which is the separation thesis, formulated by Andrei Marmor. After the English translation of Alexei's book Begriff und Geltung des Rechts, published in 2002, non-positivism finally became widespread, both in the German and English-speaking worlds and far beyond. Supposing that the notion of necessity is only understood on the strictest reading, namely analytic necessity, we can characterize three positions as being illustrated as follows. Firstly, there are in the end three and only three logically possible positions concerning the relation of law and morality, that is, legal non-positivism, which insists upon the necessary collection thesis, and the exclusive legal positivism, which claims the necessary separation thesis, and inclusive legal positivism, which relies on the contingent collection thesis. Secondly, the three positions altogether exhaust the logically possible relations between law and morality. Thirdly, the logic relations between every pair of these three positions stands in the relation of contraries. Each pair of the positions cannot be both true, although they can be both false. Therefore, the reply from Ratz can only speak to a single position of legal positivism. Where Alexei is concerned, he must defeat both forms of legal positivism. As above shown, the modality of necessity plays a significant role in the discussion. In this respect, I would like to shed some light on the few more sophisticated disputes about the notion of necessity. That is, first, necessity as pure creation. Secondly, necessity as relation of consequent to antecedent in the propositional logic. Thirdly, necessity as predestination according to the law of God, laws of nature, and etc. Fourthly, necessity as the relation of means to end, in which the end would once again be laws of nature or simply the practical purpose of some agent. Fifth, necessity as causal truth, according to natural scientific causal explanation. Natural necessity could be further classified into three groups. The first variant is the blind causal mechanical necessity as predestination. The second variant of the natural necessity is necessity as customary conjunction between natural events known only by experience, according to David Hume, or as Immanuel Kant reads it, the illusion of necessity. The third and last variant of the natural necessity is the objective necessity, presupposing the concept of cause as an a priori concept, according to Immanuel Kant's transcendental philosophy. There are also 6 groups of notion of necessity, that is, necessity as analytical truth in intentional modal logic, according to the so-called possible words semantics, or one can say analytic necessity. Until now, we can re-summarize the different variants of natural necessity into 3 different kinds of strategies, that is, supranaturalism, naturalism, or anti-naturalism. On the basis of above observations, we can then discuss about the practical significance for the concept of law. All the non-positivists insist on a necessary collection of law and morality. Robert Alexei is probably the first writer who tries intentionally to introduce analytic arguments in support of the conceptually necessary collection of law and morality. That is, the argument from law's claim to substantial correctness. This argument of correctness is analytically necessary in the strict sense of performative contradiction, which is also admitted by Ratz as I quote, a conceptual truth, quote ended. Since, however, the claim to substantial correctness is just a claim, further steps are required to ensure that this claim to correctness can be sufficiently justified. It is in this context that Alexei introduced 2 further arguments, that is, the argument from injustice, as well as the argument from principles. Still, the landscape of legal non-positivism has been changed as a result of above 3 arguments. One is analytic and the other 2 are normative. We then turn to the inclusive legal positivists. All of them acknowledge the contingent collection of law and morality, or the separability thesis. More frequently, Coleman may accept the social facts thesis or the conventionality thesis. To this extent, the inclusive legal positivists actually undergo a naturalistic strategy with a definitively weakened notion of necessity. In our line of argumentation, the exclusive legal positivist is assumed to acknowledge that there is necessarily no connection between law and morality. But the statements by Joseph Ratz are not quite that simple. In many paragraphs, Ratz expresses his views in a very similar way to other legal positivists. Coleman, however, insists that Ratz be labeled as an exclusive legal positivist. Ratz seems by himself to have only a weak concept of legal authority. As I quote, "It should be remembered that this test of claiming authority to regulate sets at most the necessary condition and not sufficient condition for a system to be a legal system. This condition is a weak one." Quote ended. Therefore, even Ratz follows 2 steps of weakening process. Firstly, asserting no necessary connection between law and morality, and secondly, adopting a weakened notion of necessity itself. Nevertheless, we should not neglect Ratz's expressions on the so-called human necessity in contrast to that of logic necessity when he discusses the possibility of a legal system without sanction. This understanding is inevitably naturalism-oriented. Now, we can surely say that the notion of necessity is definitely weakened in the legal positivistic tradition. One may wonder whether there is any exception in the legal positivistic traditions. there arises the case of the so-called pure theory of law introduced by Hans Kelsen. Kelsen intentionally follows an anti-naturalistic strategy in understanding the law, what many writers describe as a strategy of normativism. A normativist may, on the one hand, have a notion of natural necessity or causality, which is still naturalistically oriented. On the other hand, this naturalistic notion of necessity is not relevant to the normativist theorist's understanding of law. The variety of positions of strategies, along with typical writers, may be illustrated as follows. It can be concluded that to justify the necessary connection between law and morality, theorists can follow either a supranaturalistic strategy, that is, natural law theorists, or an anti-naturalistic strategy, that is, legal non-positivism. To assert that there is necessarily no connection between law and morality, exclusive legal positivists could follow either a naturalistic strategy, that is, Joseph Rath's authoritative sources thesis, or a normativistic strategy, that is, Hans Kelsen's pure theory of law. Alexis' argument from law's claim to correctness is a strict analytic argument, while Rath's authoritative sources thesis is only a normative argument, since it does not reflect logical analytic themes, but rather politic-philosophical themes. Since the notion of necessity in the legal positivistic tradition is definitely a weakened one, it cannot be justified in strictly logic sense. That's my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Feng. Well, our next speaker is Professor Claudia Toledo. She is professor at the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. Hi, Claudia. Now the floor is yours.
Hello, Anulfo, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to participate in this important event. And the title of my article in this book is The Claim to Correctness in the Thought of Robert Alexi, the necessary raising of the claim to correctness by law and the necessary connection between law and morality. So the article addresses the claim to correctness, which is one of the most controversial issues of Robert Alexi's work, questioned both by positivists and non-positivists. The approach to this issue was not presented by Alexi completely in a single book or a single article, but was developed over decades, particularly with the enrichment of his answers to the criticisms he received. And we must say that sometimes his arguments, he makes statements, but sometimes the density of the reasoning of these statements can be really questionable. Well, in the article, we looked for presenting the development of this issue, claim to correctness, in Alexi's thought, with the exposition of his first reference by Alexi in his first book, Theory of Legal Argumentation, in 1978, the German publication. Then the necessity thesis, which was well explained in his third book, The Argument from Injustice, in 1992, the German publication. And in the article, I then approached some criticisms that were made by jurists with whom Alexi debated. They were Joseph Ross, John Finnis, Eugenio Buligin, and Neil McCormick. And at the end of the article, I present some aspects of Alexi's current conception of the claim to correctness after all these debates. Well, I'm going to present this current conception of Alexi, referred to the claim to correctness, by a discursive point of view only due to the time. Well, claim to correctness is, from the discursive point of view, a validity claim of the practical discourse. It's a regulative idea that is fulfilled by argumentative justification. The general practical discourse is a discourse, a normative discourse regarding pragmatic, ethical, and moral questions and reasons. Pragmatic reasons are those that concern to the selection of suitable means for realizing goals and according to the efficiency criterion. Ethical reasons are those that express the collective self-understanding of a society based on the cultural tradition of the society. And moral reasons, they are those that express a common interest of all that have to do with the idea of universality. Well, the point is that the practical discourse, general practical discourse, is presented by Alexei as not enough to solve the problems of coordination and cooperation in social life, because it doesn't necessarily lead to decisions. And then here comes the necessity of legal discourse, which is a discourse in which necessarily we come to decisions. And these decisions are institutional. They are made by the state. They are made either by statutes or precedents, so they are binding and they guarantee legal certainty in social relations. Alexei supports the special case thesis by which legal discourse is a normative discourse bound to these institutional arguments, statutes, precedents, and legal doctrine. And a special case, as a special case, legal discourse it takes part in the practical discourse, so it also raises the claim to correctness as practical discourse raises. And this shows the necessary raising of a claim to correctness by law, since it's part of practical discourse. And Alexei demonstrates this through the performative contradiction with the fictitious constitutional article and fictitious judicial decision. And the necessary connection between law and morality this connection is well shown in hard cases, according to Alexei. Hard cases, those in which we don't find immediate answer in the positive law, and the judge has to look for reasons to justify his decision, but not in positive law, because there is an openness in positive law. So as legal discourse is based in practical discourse, Alexei sustains the integration thesis. Law would be integrated by practical discourse, so it's integrated by moral, ethical, and pragmatic reasons. And Alexei, he states a priority of the moral reasons in relation to the other. So moral reasons precede ethical reasons that precede pragmatic reasons. This way, in this openness of positive law and in this looking for reasons in practical law discourse, moral reasons are brought into law, and not any kind of morality, but a grounded morality, grounded by reasons, a justifiable morality. And this is how Alexei presents the necessary connection between law and morality by a discursive point of view. This is what I wanted to present for you today, and I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Claudia Toledo. Actually, you are very punctual. So now we will start with our next speaker. That is Professor Alejandro Tovar. He's professor at the Autonomous Metropolitan University in Mexico. And Professor Tovar, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Arnulfo. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por estar aquí en el auditorio. A continuación voy a hablar en inglés para, obviamente, nuestros invitados, pero no quería dejar de agradecer en idioma español a nuestros colegas. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor for me to be in this online event. Thanks to the facility that Professor Enrique Cáceres y Jorge Fabra granted us for this seminar. También agradezco a Patty. Professor Cáceres has always shown an interest in epistemological plurality, and to present this book devoted to Professor Alexis' legal philosophy is a cause for celebration. This is also an opportunity, perhaps unique, to meet with outstanding friends and colleagues from all over the world who made possible this event and this book, which I work on with my dear friends Claudia, Arnulfo, and Gonzalo. I would like to take this opportunity to thank, of course, Arnulfo, Gonzalo, and Claudia for letting me work with them. For this book, I decided to write a short essay for the section dedicated to Alexis' philosophy of law, one of the three sections in which this work is divided. I also made a translation of Claudia Toledo's work by Feng, Greetings by, and Stanley Paulson's little essay on validity in Kelsen and Alexis. This essay is dedicated to Robert Alexis' claim to correctness, which is one of the central main tenets of Alexis' non-positivism. In order to explain this, in the first section, I expose the concept and normative nature of the claim to correctness in the work of Robert Alexis, while in the second section, I present some replies raised both by Eugenio Buliguin and Joseph Raz to this claim. In the third section, I connect this claim with the idea of moral constraints of law, and finally, in the fourth section, I expose my remarks to the claim to correctness, which aims to reduce the degree of arbitrariness and injustice in law, but only at some extent. Since the publication of a theory of legal argumentation in 1978, the claim to correctness, the Anspruch auf Richtigkeit, has been a keystone of Robert Alexis' non-positivist theory of law. Even though the claim to correctness appeared for the first time in a theory of legal argumentation, it is in the Argument from Injustice, Begriffung Geltung des Rechts, a reply to legal positivism, published in Germany in 1992, in which the claim is presented as a linchpin of his non-positivist theory of law. Indeed, in a theory of legal argumentation, the claim to correctness appeared for the first time, although this claim was part of the special case thesis, who holds that legal discourse is a special case of a general practical discourse. But according to the claim to correctness, which, while it was referred only to the legal argumentation, was still quite embryonic, because in this early work, this claim referred only to legal argumentation and legal decision-making, and not law as such. As it can be seen now, the necessity of the claim to correctness was already in the previous works of Alexis, but still underdeveloped in terms of showing the connection between the claim to correctness and the dual nature of law thesis. The core of is inclusive non-positivism. It is, however, in the Argument from Injustice, in which the claim to correctness fully developed into a genuine argument on behalf of non-positivism, and it was subsequently exposed in later articles as an argument concerning the dual nature of law. But what is exactly the claim to correctness in the context of the Argument from Injustice? In my essay, I explained the criticism by positivist authors such as Eugenio Buliguin and Joseph Raz, and I focus my interest in these objections. I also, after explaining the Alexis' response to Buliguin and Raz, I lay out an argument regarding the claim to correctness. Perhaps, in my opinion, a practical problem with the claim to correctness is that it has proved to be essentially correct. The connection between law and morality, what Alexis understands as morality, can be substantiated through the claim to correctness. The question is whether there are any reasons to believe that the claim to correctness prevents to use law as an instrument of cruelty or extreme injustice. Alexis is right in maintaining that even a dictatorship cannot make explicit what lies implicit. But the core of my question is the possibility of still inflicting severe injustice in the name of moral claims. The claim to correctness, while is necessarily bound to a claim to justifiability, is not enough to guarantee that bad judges and governors can be halted in their tracks. That is, this claim cannot prevent daily abuses of law, nor that all abuses will repent or what they do, for the wrongfulness of the abuses of power could be justified from a personal or a moral point of view. There are some cases in which the dividing line between severe and extreme injustice could be seen as not so self-evident, as Alexi believes when he refers to the Radbruch formula. And by these incorrect norms, and legal decisions could find a justification under the tapestry of correctness. What is more, one can say with confidence that even unjust legal systems could make use of the claim to correctness to morally justify corrupted law. For we will look in vain if we try to find for explicit utterances of power and domination like the ones presented by Alexi. The pervasiveness of disagreement about what is ought to be understood as morally justified in some cases provide reasons to doubt about the reach of this moral claim, which seeks to turn moral defectiveness into legal defectiveness. But even if the claim to correctness is never enough to guarantee that immoral legal systems can be institutionalized and maintained through the very force of law, it is possible to give a reasonable weight to the arguments on behalf of the claim to correctness, and therefore to create or to impose some moral constraints on law. The relation between law and morality has been addressed by many forms, either to affirm it or to deny it. Whether one agrees with Alexis' characterization of the connection thesis and the separability thesis into the modern debate of positivism and non-positivism, the claim to correctness is thus presented as an endeavor to apprehend and portray the law as something that claims to be rational, by means of showing that law cannot be anything whatsoever, like Kelsen said. Once again, I thank Professor Enrique Cáceres for allowing us to present this work dedicated to Professor Alexi, as well as the friends and colleagues all over the world who gathered today to make this event possible. And I hope it will be of interest to the Spanish-speaking community with an interest in the philosophy of law. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, muchas gracias. And I will say only something in Spanish. Si alguien quiere en México encontrar este libro, se encuentra en la página de difuris.com, si alguien lo quiera adquirir. Esperemos que tenga una buena recepción en nuestro idioma. Once again, thank you very much. And Arnulfo, la persona siguiente.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. That was such a nice speech and a presentation. So now our next speaker is Professor Carsten Bäcker. He's professor at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. Professor Carsten Bäcker.
Ja, muchas gracias, Arnulfo. Buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días a ustedes. Here it's almost night now, so it's pretty dark in here. So maybe that's why I said buenas noches. However, I'm glad that I have the chance to present my paper here. I have made a little presentation. I hope it's visible. Arnulfo, can you see the presentation?
Yes, I do. Yes, everything is okay.
Yeah, you can see.
Yes,
maybe
yes.
I should start it in a minute. Like this, better?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So it's always English at top and Spanish below, so it should work. Of course, my Spanish, but it's the Spanish of my dear translator. I think it's Gonzalo. Okay, so actually it's 9 theses, as the title says, and it's all about the role of arguments in decisions, so to speak, of course, with an eye to legal decisions. And the first very basic thesis, very basic idea is that decisions should be correct. I think this is not really a problem. Everybody would more or less agree with this thesis, I think. More complicated would be the second one. If decisions are supposed to be correct, and they are only correct if and only if they are rationally justifiable. This is very Alexian in a way, very typical for Alexian thinking. And so you have to give reasons for your decisions. You have to be able to justify them. They don't have to be justified necessarily, but they have to be justifiable. So you need reasons in order to prove your decisions true. In this paper you have in the book, I try to argue for all these theses, of course. The time is not enough to give you all the arguments, but I just wanted to present the 9 theses so you know what the paper is about. And if you're interested in that, you can, of course, have a look into the arguments as well. Okay, so you need arguments to make your decisions justified. Without arguments if not possible. Third thesis, decisions must be rationally justifiable. You have to be able to justify them. That's the difference. They're correct if they're justifiable, so they have to be justifiable. This is more or less the result of the first two theses. The first one, decisions can be rational, justified through discursive procedures. This is, of course, not the only way to give rational reasons for decisions, but this is one way, and this is the way the discourse theory chose. This is the way that Robert Alexi chose in 1978, or some years before, when he published his first book on the theory of legal argumentation. So you need to have a discourse that is following the discourse procedure rules, and if you follow these rules, and if you give your arguments, and you are able to convince the other participants of this discourse, then you have something that might be called rational justifiable or rational justified. Yeah, if you agree with this, if you say discourse theory is a good thing, we can find our reasons there, and we can discuss, and we can justify our decisions, then you have to be aware that the thing you are justifying, the decision and your reasons, are not necessarily true, but they are necessarily relative or relative. So this is relativism coming in, and I don't know how many idealists are out there, but maybe some relativists as well. Again, you can of course say this is not convincing. You have to look into the arguments. I can't do that here, but this is the thesis. I think that if you go to the discourse, if you use discourse to provide reasons for your arguments, those reasons are at least relative to the discourse you had, and the discourse as well is relative to the rules of the discourse, and the rules of the discourse are relative to the idea of the discourse or the ideal of the discourse. So there's no objectivity just there. Yeah, ask Jan Siegmann and others, they will say this is wrong, but we have to go into the arguments then. Now, what kind of relativity do we have here? This is the sixth thesis. Only 3 more to go after this, and this is by far the longest thesis. The relativity of discursive procedures and their results consists in 2 kinds. A, the justification of the discourse as a procedure. This is maybe called the extra discursive relativity. And the second one is that the results of the discourse are possible qua the discursive procedure as such. So this is the relativity intra-discursive, so to speak. And you can have other results in the discourse. They all have reasons, and will all be equally justified. And we have this in law all the time. We could say A or B or C to a given legal problem, and they are all equally legally justified. So then you have a relativity of A to B and to C. And the extra discourse relativity is that your discourse as such has also rules that could be other rules. So 2 kinds of relativity, a kind of double relativity, so to speak. Yeah, 7th thesis. If you say you need to justify your decisions, and we started this way, and you say we can justify them by discourse, and you agree that discourse only leads to relative choices or reasons or justifications, then you must say that decisions that you have justified discursively can only be relatively correct. So this is all we get. There's only relative correctness. And now, if you think that Alexi wants in the law to raise the claim to correctness, this would also mean to relative correctness only, because there is no more. So this is shaking a bit the whole building Alexi erased. But only shaking, it's not breaking down. So 8th thesis, decisions must be, if they're relative, we have to make sure that they are justified as far as possible. This is the principal theory in discourse theory, so to speak, You have to optimize your discourse in order to find those decisions that are as best as possible. Well, and then final thesis, legal decision makers cannot claim that the decisions are correct or just in a perfect sense, but only that they're relatively correct or relatively just, and we don't have anymore. And this is, of course, it means quite a bit about lawyers, that lawyers are not supposed to raise the claim to absolute correctness. They would never do that, and they can't do that, not able to reach there. At least they wouldn't know if they did. Yeah, so it's easier for lawyers to adjust to this theory. Well, finally, what's the result of all of this? I think discourse theory allows us to find a theory of legal argumentation, but this theory of legal argumentation is just providing us with relative correctness and no more. So we have to minimize those effects of relativity in law in order to find the most reasonable decisions. And this means we have to do 3 steps as lawyers, all of us. The first one would be we have to acknowledge that there are arbitrary elements in the law, subjective arbitrary elements. If we do not want to acknowledge this, or we don't want to accept this, then we are dreamers. We can, of course, be dreamers, but we shouldn't be dreamers, I think. Second point, if we accept that there's arbitrary elements, we should try to minimize those arbitrary elements by optimizing those circumstances that will provide a discourse that is as best as it could be. And then, third point, if we have these discourse rules, maybe parliamentary rules, we have to provide in these parliamentary decisions or legal decisions the judge is taking, we have to provide as much argumentative justification as we can. And then we have the best decisions we can have, but there is no more than best. That's all. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Carsten Bäcker. That was a very provocative presentation. So we will open a space for debate at the end of all the presentations. So our next speaker is Professor Martín Aldao. He's professor at the University of Buenos Aires. Professor Aldao, thank you very much for being with us.
Hello, how are you? Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank to Gonzalo, Claudia, Alejandro, and Arnulfo for all the work on this book. It's good also that we are presenting, I'm presenting our work after Professor Bäcker. I would say that we are working on optimizing the circumstances of legal discourse. This is our thesis with Laura, is that legal argumentation as developed by Robert Alexi could be this debate strongly linked with strong models of democracy, such as Habermas' theory of deliberative democracy. We would like to work on that line, and because they share this these basic rules of discourse that are basic rules of democracy. And I think you can see them there. Anyone able to speak may take part in the discourse. Everyone can problematize any assertion, and no speaker may be denied of these rights. We think that these 3 rules allow us to connect Alexis' theory of legal argumentation with a strong understanding of democracy. However, Laura and I work usually with inter-American case law and local case law here in America Latina, and is often a critic that we have to face is that Alexis and Habermas' theory is developed for North Atlantic democracies, well-functioning democracies and all that, and that this strong assumption on equality of the participants on the discourse, it's not an actual fact. So these models can be applied to understand how legal argumentation works in the global south. Our thesis is that it's okay, this is a problem. We don't have equality as a starting point of democracy or society in Latin America, but we think there are inside legal theory certain devices or tools that can complement Alexis' theory of legal argumentation in order to tackle from inside legal discourse inequality issues. So we propose to make a collaboration between legal argumentation, such as developed by Alexis, and stereotype analysis, such as developed by Cook, Cusack, Hill Collins, Timmer, and Maria Jose Añón Roy. Here we have a lot of legal development on stereotyping and human rights. We choose gender and stereotyping because it's very well developed in inter-American case law. It's it's a legal tool and a legal argumentation tool that points to or tries to solve these participation issues that actual democracies have. And we also choose it because it's very well ordered and well developed, and there's a series of steps that allows us to, in a rational way, identify the problems and tackle them, the problems of that hinder women participation in actual public discourse and in the fundamentation and legitimation of democratic institutions from inside the law. I'm going to pass very fast here. We can identify stereotypes. We can name the stereotypes. We have to assess the stereotypes and to eradicate the stereotypes. And I have to finish now because here is our conclusion. We think that if we can enrich Alexis' model in order to make it work in very unequal context with tools such as gender stereotyping as developed by the Inter-American Court. Well, thank you very much, and sorry for the problems when I start and for my English.
Thank you very much, Professor Aldao. Now our next speaker is Professor Noelia Martinez Dualo. She's professor at the University of La Coruña. Thank you, Professor Noelia. Now you can start with.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Arnulfo, for introducing me, also to the editors, the organizers, and the attendants for being here today. Greetings from A Coruña, Galicia, Spain. And in my piece, I intend to provide some arguments for helping interpret Alexis' theory of principles, which hopefully could contribute to increasing even more its applicability. In the first two sections, I recall Alexis' theory of principles, beginning with the semantic conception of the norm, which clearly distinguishes between norms and normative statements. According to this conception, as you know, norms are the meaning of normative statements, making it possible to express the same norm through different statements, normative statements. Thus, norms are primary to normative statements, making it impossible to find the criteria for identifying norms in the normative statements, but they lie behind the norm itself, and specifically the basic deontological modes of command, prohibition, and prohibition. Building upon Dawkins' classification, Alexis sorts all norms into rules and principles, as you know, while recognizing similarities between both concepts insofar as norms. Rules and principles are formulated through the basic deontic expressions and present reasons to concrete judgments concerning what ought to be done. According to Alexis, the difference between rules and principles is not only gradual, but also qualitative. And unlike rules, principles are norms that require the realization of something to the greatest degree possible, given the existing legal and factual possibilities. In this sense, principles are optimization requirements characterized by their fulfillment in degrees, considering the sound legal and factual possibilities. Whilst the scope of legal possibilities is determined by those principles and rules in contraposition, rules are only susceptible to being observed or unobserved, and when a rule is valid, its content must invariably be observed. For rules encompass setting settings that fall within what is factual and legally possible. Moreover, Alexei points out differences derives from conflicts that frequently arise within both categories. Conflicts of rules have to be solved through the introduction of an exception clause or by declaring invalid one of the conflicting rules, given that the legal concept of validity cannot be arranged in degrees. By contrast, in the case of conflicting principles, one of them has to yield, which says nothing about its validity nor requires an exception clause, but under certain circumstances, one principle prevails, whereas in other settings, the reply might be the opposite. Therefore, a conditional relation of precedence lies beneath principles. Considering that only valid principles are susceptible to collision, such conflicts go beyond validity and before the scope of balancing. Another distinctive trait is the different prima facie conditions of rules and principles. Principles ordered to do something to the greatest extent possible, given the system legal and factual possibilities always. Thus, principles do not involve definitive reasons to act, but prima facie ones that might be displaced by opposite reasons. Besides, principles lack of determinative content concerning conflicting principles and factual possibilities, so further criteria are required to figure out such conflicts. And despite this lack of determinacy, when reasons underlying a concrete principle prosper in the given circumstances, the rule solving the conflict enjoys definitive character. Nevertheless, the definitive character of rules is not immovable, but it could be removed through the introduction of an exception clause which speaks against this trait as distinctive of rules. Such an exception could be introduced through a principle, a seal for the rule to be displaced. A rule not only requires the presence of a stronger principle prevailing over the principle backing such rule, but those formal principles establishing the observance of the rule must also be superseded, which certainly curbs the occurrence of this sort of prevalence in practice. Additionally, the character of principle could be reinforced through the imposition of an onus of argumentation over principles in contraposition, yet this strengthening cannot be compared with the definitive character of rules that is essentially different and stronger. Principles and rules are different kinds of reasons. Principles involve prima facie reasons for action, whereas rules provide definitive reasons, save the establishment of an exception, and both rules and principles may be considered reasons for action or reasons for norms. In Alexei's view, rules can be reasons for rules and principles can be reasons for odd judgments. Although principles can be basic reasons for concrete odd judgments, they are never definitive reasons. In contrast, reasons for rules are definitive reasons for such odd judgments. Section 3 of my piece is devoted to summarizing some of the most repeated objections to Alexei's theory of principles, which I later used to introduce my questions and interpretative notes on Alexei's theory in the last section of my chapter. As for the lack of determinative content of principles regarding conflicting principles and factual possibilities, it is reasonable to wonder how those conditions affecting the application of a normative statement about a principle are to be determined and whether principles need more determinate norms, that is, rules, to get further specified. To accept that principles unavoidably require rules to specify their conditions of applicability leads to defining them as commands directed to public authorities and to a great extent to restrict their position to the Constitution. The Spanish system of constitutional rights illustrates this conclusion, since while constitutional rights are directly claimable by individuals, the only means to directly protect them is to file a writ of protection before the Constitutional Court, which ultimately serves to test the constitutionality of a previous judicial decision that allegedly affects such rights. Constitutional rights need to be specified by the legislature, and such a specification normally translates translates into rules establishing concrete subjective rights. For instance, patients' right to informed consent was shaped by the Spanish Constitutional Court in 2011 as a specification of the constitutional right to moral and physical integrity of Article 15 of the Spanish Constitution. And although principles can be owed judgments and thus their applicability does not inevitably require rules, they naturally come to justify other norms, providing the legal system with cohesion and consistency. In this vein, the legal principle of moral and physical integrity serves as justification for patients' right to informed consent, for instance, and similarly, rights to data protection are funded, justified, that's it, by the constitutional right to privacy in Spain is guaranteed in Article 18 of the Spanish Constitution. As for the objection concerning the definitive character of certain principles considered to be absolute, as for instance human dignity, it could be argued that nothing prevents them from colliding with themselves. And this type of self-collision could occur due to the allocation of certain legal positions to a variety of different subjects. This presupposes the existence of certain legal relationships established by rules that specify the allocation conditions of positions based on a principle with such an important content as to grant unconditional preference, while the absolute character of principles is undeniably questionable. Interests protected under certain principles, such as that of human dignity, are certainly essential, which could justify speaking of first-order principles or even preferential principles. Although the precedence of first-order principles is never categorical, for they can always collide with each other, they are subject to prima facie or a prima facie presumption of priority due to their great importance, obviously. The contended twofold relationship of justification and specification that mediates between principles and rules considerably blurs the different dimensions in which conflicts of rules and principles and conflicts of principles occur, that is, validity and balance respectively, as you know. When in a conflict of rules, the underlying principles can be invoked, the conflict will be displaced from the dimension of validity to that of balance, meaning that such rules are never definitive but merely conditional. If the solution of a conflict of principles requires granting one priority over the other, then the principle that yields is completely disregarded, which clashes with the idea of its gradual application. However, in this respect, a distinction must be made between the solution of the case and the application of the rule for the solution of the case, because it is obvious that once reached, a solution must be one and definitive. It makes no sense to think that the solution to a conflict of principles can be gradual or open, but it must be unavoidably definitive and specific about all its aspects. The application of a rule for solving a conflict or principles has a different consideration, since balancing requires considering the pros and cons of applying the content of the rules in conflict under the given circumstances. Thus, the defeated principle does not lose its value, nor does it cease to be considering the balancing, but rather it modulates the solution of the case. Besides, from the distinction between optimization requirements and requirements to be optimized introduced by Alexei himself, it can be concluded that such gradual compliance refers to the optimization requirement, yet not so to the content of the principle itself, that is those requirements that or to be optimized, so to say. And yeah, this is all from my side, and thanks once again to all of you.
Thank you, Professor Noelia Martinez. Now, our next speaker is Professor Jan-Reinard Sigman, who is professor at the University of Erlangen-Núremberg. Professor Jan Sigman, thank you very much for being with us today. So now you can start.
Okay, thank you very much. And also thank you to all the editors of the book and the organizers of this event. I'm very pleased that I can present here my contribution on Alexei's theory of principles. Well, Well, I will focus on two critical points. That is the concept of principles of Alexey and the weight formula. Well, the concept of principles. As we already have heard, Alexey defines principles as requirements of optimization that to be realized to the highest possible relative to factual and legal possibilities. Now, we should keep in mind, well, first, we are not looking for the true concept of principles. It's a technical definition. We have to ask, what is the point? Why do we need the concept of principles? And also for Alexey and of the whole theory of principles, the starting point is to connect principles or the distinction of rules and principles with that of balancing and, on the other hand, subsumption and deduction as the application of rules. So what we must understand is how can principles work as reasons in balancing procedures. And this starting point is also accepted by Alexey. The problem is the definition of principles as requirements of optimization does not explain, in fact, is incompatible with the idea that principles are reasons which collide with other principles and have to be balanced against competing principles. This is because optimization requirements are relative to the factual and legal possibilities, that is to competing principles. And so, in fact, there's no conflict. In fact, we can reduce all optimization requirements to one optimization requirement to find an optimal solution of all the normative demands in conflict. So the optimization requirement does not participate in the balancing. It is not a reason for a balancing judgment. Rather, it is a second-order rule which guides the balancing, but itself has the character of a rule that is a strictly valid norm, at least regarding the balancing in question. It's a rule, second-order rule, and this definition of principles optimization requirements cannot explain the crucial point which was meant to explain. Well, this critique has been offered quite early by various authors, and took some time, but when his doctorate students came to depart from his theory, Martin Borowski wrote, well, it's wrong, but still it sounds convincing, but it was untenable. That, and in the end, also Alexey realized. Then he offered modification of the theory. He said, well, optimization requirements are second-order rules, but the object of the optimization requirement is a principle. That is somewhat surprisingly, I had rejected this view, this possibility already in my dissertation, because the object of an optimization requirement, well, it's a norm, but it does not have any structure, any specific structural properties. It's a substantive issue whether the object of an optimization requirement is, in fact, object of an optimization requirement. It's not a structural property. And the point was that rules and principles should be distinct by structural properties. But objects of the optimization requirements can have any structure. There can be demands, permissions. There's no structural distinction. So obviously, this attempt also fails. And well, it took some time. In particular, Ralph Posser criticized again and again his Alexey's theory. And finally, Alexey said, well, this idea that principles are the objects of optimization requirements is not correct because this leads to their norms. As norms, they have a deontic modalities, and we have an iteration of deontic modalities. And Alexey finally said, no, there's only one deontic modality, the requirement to optimize. So, but then he is back again to his first position, and this was untenable. So in the end, Alexey does not offer any plausible account of principles if one tries to explain how principles can figure as reasons in balancing with competing principles. Well, that is the first point. The second point is the weight formula. Well, the weight formula tries to formalize the criteria of balancing, where balancing has to do with the weight and the weighing of principles in conflict. Alexiad offers a law of balancing, which says the greater the interference in a principle is, the stronger the more important must be the reasons to justify this interference. This is all fine, and one can say, well, we have factors, the degree of interference and the relative weight of the principles that are relevant. Both together, one can say, define the weight of the principle in the concrete case. What one then would expect if balancing has to do with optimization is to define what optimality in this context means. But Alexei does not go in this direction, although there is a definition of optimality, but Alexei then offered his weight formula. There are many critical points regarding the weight formula. Why introduce, well, he says a relative weight of principles is defined, well, he has two versions, let's only take one. It's defined by the quotient between a product of factors, the degree of interference, the abstract weight, and the reliability of premises. And we have to calculate the product of these factors for one principle and for the other, and the quotient of these products then defines the relative weight. Well, there are many points that one could debate. Why introduce a notion of relative weight that has no connection to the model of balancing developed before? The concept of intensity of interference is one of the factors is unclear. The factor of reliability, whether it is really a factor in first order balancing, is a point which I think is not correct. But the point that I'm interested in, that I will focus is, well, Alexei regards the weight formula as an analog to the deductive scheme. One of the points of balancing is it's a distinct mode of application, distinct from subsanctional balancing. And now Alexei says the weight formula is an analog to the scheme of deductive inference. But if it's a scheme of deductive inference, there's no structural difference to subsumption and deduction. In fact, at one point, Alexei also says it's the weight formula is only an illustration. We can replace numbers by sentences. In fact, arguments must use sentences. But if we do that, then we get a deductive argument. So Alexei's approach also fails in this respect. It must explain, or should explain, why balancing is a distinct mode of application, distinct from substantial balancing, and exactly that Alexei doesn't do. So in fact, he doesn't have any plausible theory of principles and balancing that could explain that what it should explain. Now, one might think that I regard Alexei's theory as really bad, but that is not true. Still, the theory is better than most of other theories in legal theory. Most legal theorists reject the structural difference between rules and principles, which I think is an obvious point, that norms that we apply by substantial balancing have a different logical structure than norms that we apply in a situation of conflict and balance against each other. It seems to me obvious. So in this point, Alexei certainly is better than all the other logical distinctions. Then what is the point? What is the problem? I think if we want to explain this distinction between rules and principles and the specific character of balancing principles, we must depart from very basic assumptions. We must depart from the idea that arguments are a sort of proposition. Propositions, that is, well, as we present, there is a claim that they are true, that they are correct. And this means that we have to depart from all argumentation theory, because all modern argumentation theory makes this assumption. Arguments are premises from which a certain conclusion follows logically. All these accounts accept the propositional approach, also the ontologic, also Dworkin is talking about existing rights. All these theories talk about normative problems as if there exist norms, and now we have to find out which norms exist. We have to come to know which norms exist. We have to make statements which claim to be true. This is also a point of Alexei. Alexei explicitly says that this is the point of his theory. And with this approach, he can't explain how we have principles that figure as reasons and balancing. Because if these reasons and balancing are propositions, they claim to state facts. And if they are facts and there can be no incompatible facts, then implicitly we must reject incompatible facts. And that is exactly what we do with rules. Rules cannot be in a genuine conflict with other rules because rules are a kind of normative facts. And if a rule is valid, then there can be no incompatible rule valid at the same time. So we must reject this fundamental view that arguments are premises with a structure of propositions. And that is, we must, in fact, leave aside almost all of the modern practical philosophy. Practical philosophy is done as a theoretical philosophy regarding norms, and not as a practical philosophy which must explain how we come to believe or justifiably believe that certain norms are valid. And as long as we start with this assumption that argumentation is about which normative statements are true or correct, we will not understand the structure of balancing. So Alexi's theory doesn't work, but it's not that it is really particularly bad. It's just, I think it's the best theory starting from this point, as one could say, this point of an observer who thinks that there's a reality of norms and we have to find out what this reality is. As long as we take this position, we can describe balancing from outside, but we cannot really understand what principles to be balanced mean and what this procedure of balancing is. Well, that's basically the point of my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sigman. I'm looking forward for the debate. So now our next speaker is Professor Martin Borowski. He is professor at the University of Heidelberg. Professor Borowski, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for organizing this splendid event and for giving me the opportunity to listen to esteemed colleagues and for the opportunity to express some thoughts myself. Equality rights seem to be difficult to grasp. There is a number of reasons for this. I will mention 6 of them. First, provisions in constitutions and international instruments for the protection of human rights are, so it seems, usually prohibitions of discrimination. They were mentioned just in this panel, which only rule out certain grounds for differential treatment. This is not, however, a full assessment of the issue of equality. You also need the general right to equality in some form or another. Second, equality rights are located in both the first generation of human rights, namely civil and political rights. This is equality as equal treatment. And in the second generation of human rights, namely economic, social, and cultural rights. This is equal results as the end or aim of state action. Deciding equality cases often ranges over both generations of rights. Third, both equal treatment and equal results often play a role in assessing claims stemming from equality rights, and there are typically also other principles involved which require prima facie equal or differential treatment. This is to say that the structure of balancing equality rights is usually more complex compared to balancing liberty rights. Fourth, proportionality and balancing play a role in assessing claims stemming from equality rights. To be sure, compared to balancing liberty rights, different principles must be balanced. Only principles requiring equal or differential treatment might be considered. Fifth, even though liberty principles and equality principles need to be clearly distinguished, liberty issues play a role in determining the severity and, in turn, the weight of unequal treatment. Equality and liberty are different, but somehow connected. 6. the ends justifying unequal treatment do not give always rise to an empirical means to an end relation. This is to say that there may be external ends, then suitability, necessity, proportionality in its narrow sense must be assessed, and internal ends, so that there is only balancing according to proportionality in its narrower sense. So 6 reasons. There are other reasons that could be added to the list, but these 6 aspects shall suffice for the purposes of my brief address today, 10 minutes only. When Robert Alexy, the extraordinary talent celebrated with the Festschrift today, wrote his Theorie der Grundrechte, his seminal monograph on the theory and doctrine of constitutional rights in 1985, the first aspect, accepting and unfolding the general right to equality, had already been undertaken in the German doctrine on constitutional rights, in academic writing and in the case law of the German Federal Constitutional Court. The second aspect has not been clearly understood, I would say, and one might add that this applies still today, but Alexy laid the foundation for comprehending this issue. His chapter on equality in the Theorie der Grundrechte developed the third and the fourth aspect, which will be in the limelight in what follows briefly. This was the basis on which progress with an eye to the fifth and the sixth aspect, achieved by academics standing on Alexy's shoulders, became possible. Turning now to the third and fourth aspects, one of the most fundamental issues in interpreting equality is the complexity arising from the fact that equality can refer to either acts or results. Equality refers to acts if and when equality is understood as even-handed treatment. The core function of the general right to equality is to provide for the right to even-handed treatment by the government. For there are limiting reasons for even-handed treatment imaginable, this right is not an absolute right, rather it is a prima facie right amenable to limitation and balancing. By contrast, equality refers to results if and when the government acts to establish a state of equal results. Let us assume that children of wealthy parents are more likely to succeed in study at university compared to children of poor parents. This may be taken to mean that there is no true equality of opportunity with an eye to study at university. One may assume that there is a constitutional obligation of the state to arrive at equal results. This requires that measures of promoting equal results are put in place. For example, means-tested scholarships or other forms of financial subsidy. One may, of course, argue whether and to what extent there is such constitutional obligation. If one assumes such obligation, it is clear that differential treatment, not even-handed treatment, differential treatment is required. The subsidies are to be awarded only to children of poor parents, while rich parents get nothing. The realization of factual equality typically requires differential treatment from the point of view of legal equality. There is a typical tension between factual and legal equality that requires that both equality principles be balanced. Alexy has coined the expression equality paradox. This is key to understanding the third and the fourth aspect on my list and the heart of the structure of equality rights. According to the reasonable assumption in a liberal democracy that the first generation of human rights, the prima facie priority enjoys it over the second generation of human rights, so that legal equality, the prima facie right to equal treatment, then consequently enjoys prima facie priority over a prima facie right to equal results, factual equality. Even though Alexy's principles theory in constitutional law was generally the result of a critical reconstruction of the case law of the German Federal Constitutional Court, it deserves to be mentioned that there was no clear case law on equality rights when Alexei wrote his famous book. The court developed its new formula in 1980, and Alexei finished writing his habilitation thesis in 1983. Considering the publication delay at that time and the fact that neither the court could be aware of Alexei's writings, nor Alexei could quote the new formula, the idea of balancing equality principles was developed actually in a parallel fashion by the court and Alexei. The new formula was developed further in the case law and now also, after decades, reflects the fifth aspect, that equality and liberty are different but connected. That Alexei developed independently by means of academic research what would quickly become the key structure of the court's new formula on equality rights is certainly among the biggest compliments that a scholar on constitutional law and constitutional theory can actually receive. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Martin Borowski. Now, last but not least, we'll have the participation of Professor Natalina Isamile. She is professor at the University of Brasil. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for your introduction. And first of all, I would like to say a few words. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, even if in a virtual way, at this international conference on philosophy dedicated to la filosofía jurídica en la era del neuroderecho, and organized by Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and to take part to this panel about the presentation of the book Derecho, Argumentación y Ponderación, Ensayos en honor a Robert Alexi. So I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the international conference, and especially the organizers of this event, Gonzalo, Claudia, Alejandro, and Arnulfo. Thank you very much for creating this space. I also want to thank everyone who is attending or listening to this international conference and our book presentation. And of course, I would like to say thank you to everybody who is sharing with me this panel. Before starting, I would like to apologize in advance for my English. I'm nervous because I know that my English is not so good to speak in public, something that I do only on a rare occasion. Please apologize me for that, for my terrible pronunciation and for my very strong Italian accent. But I promise I will do my best. As the title of my chapter suggested, El conflicto entre norma al debate Friedrich Müller y Robert Alexi, the debate on the conflict between norms, Friedrich Müller and Robert Alexi, one of the aims of the study is to analyze the relationship between rules and principles through the debate of two important legal philosophers and constitutionalists, Müller and Alexi. In a nutshell, shortly, my study can be divided into 3 or 4 parts. In the first part, the introduction, I focus my attention on the definition and implication of the term constitution, its evolution, its relevance, especially in post-war European constitutionalism. There are several ways to think about it. We can identify at least 3 definitions: constitution as a liberal political order, constitution as a set of fundamental norms, and constitution as a source of law. After World War II, a shift occurred in constitutionalism with the documents like the Grundgesetz, the German Basic Law, the Italian Constitution, and the French Constitution. These constitutions arose from a reaction against totalitarianism and emphasized individual rights, human dignity, and democracy. As some scholars noted, post-war constitutions created a system of check and balance to guarantee and protect fundamental rights. So the study of the conflict between norms, especially when they involve fundamental rights, is crucial. In the second and the third part of my study, I analyze the theories elaborated by Friedrich Müller, the structuring theory of law, and by Robert Alexy, the theory of legal argumentation. Especially, I pay attention on the conflict between legal norms. On one hand, Friedrich Müller noticed the interrelationship between legal dogmatics, legal methodology, and the theory of norm. According to Müller, issues present in the legal doctrine originated from methodological problems, which were themselves rooted in flaw from legal norms theory. In relation to the latter, Müller tried to develop a new theory of legal norm, moving from the practice of law. So, Müller called this new paradigm post-positivist. The post-positivist theory of norm seeks to break with the dualism between sign and solemn, norm and reality. In a nutshell, the theory of norm formulated by Müller is based on the difference between sign and solemn, legal norm and a normative test. The main claim is that the normative test is only a preliminary form, and for this it is crucial to develop methodologically the passage from the test to the norm. It is realized by the new understanding of the structure of the legal norm, based on two central components, the norm program and the normative domain. Friedrich Müller points to some characteristic of the structuring legal theory, defining it as a realistic theory, since it requires contribution from social science, especially throughout the concept of normative domain. It is also a theory of action and is inherently composed of elements originating from linguistic. On the other side, Alexy's theory of legal argumentation, or Alexy's theory or principles, is based on the difference between rules and principles. Rules are applied in an all or nothing manner, while principles require balancing. Without repeating what's already been said, the collision or conflict between principles involves approaches of balancing according to their weight and their importance in a given situation. Without abusing of your attention and the time at my disposal, to conclude as a comparative analysis, I will highlight just 2 points. The first, the theories of Müller and Alexy offer different ways of understanding how the conflicts between norms are resolved. Müller emphasized the active role of judges in constructive legal norms, while Alexy stressed the importance of balancing principle in legal decision-making. The second point, their theories challenge us to reconsider the relationship between law and morality or ethics and democracy. Thank you very much for your attention y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor Natalina Stamile, and thank you very much to all the participants and the speakers of this event for the, the first event for the publication of this book. Now we open the space for debate. So actually, all of the speakers can ask each other, and probably later we can receive some questions from the public. But I mean, feel free to ask something or comment or do a general questions.
Lieber Carsten, I always find your theory very interesting, you know. But this time at the end of your exposition, I found something very special that I didn't find earlier. In your result, you said that we have to optimize the conditions. So what is the reason why we have to optimize? I mean, if there is no ideal dimension of correctness, there is no need for optimization. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Gonzalo. We have discussed this, I think, earlier, but this is, of course, a discussion that could go on for some time. But I think that we have an aim of optimization also without idealism. This is not idealism, but it is an idea of what could be ideal. And this is also an aim, but of course it's not an objective aim or an absolute aim or a perfect aim or whatever, but it's just an aim that we can pursue and hope that it will be better. But of course this aim could change, and then we have to again optimize our discourse or discursive rules and our discussions to this changed ideal of discourse. And this is of course relativistic. This is not idealistic. On Alexis, well, on your lawyer-like defense of Alexis not recognizing the neue Formel in the Verfassungsgerichtsrechtsprechung of 1980. Actually, I think it was the first Senate who first started this neue Formel idea, but then the second Senate came much later. I think like maybe 10 volumes or so later. So this might be the reason why he didn't really find this new formula in all the rulings we had of the Constitutional Court, because it has not been ständige Rechtsprechung, of course. It was just one decision, strange enough. And the balancing idea is also in the Willkürlichkeitsgrenze, in the Willkür formula, in the older formula. This is what he and what you said, but what he said. I think this is also there, the balancing idea. So it's not really new in the new formula, but it's explicit there. It has been implicit before, because yes, you need, in order to say what is wesentliche Gleichheit or Willkür, you have to balance, of course. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Yeah, just a remark.
Yeah, I think this is more a remark than a question, but of course I'm happy to comment on the remark. I think it is obvious with hindsight. I would actually doubt that it was obvious at that time, actually. And this may have changed, but when I was writing my PhD thesis and was kind of reworking it in the second round, I would say, so in the 2010s, there was still quite some criticism from academic colleagues whether equality judgments are actually the result of a balancing. And you said that we now understand the kind of first formulae as referring to a result of balancing. When the court introduced the new formula, it kept the old one and tried to have different areas of application for the old formula and for the new formula. And then the court, in a kind of second or third round, then only kind of itself came to the conclusion that this actually is not two standards, but it's a kind of, the old one is a more lenient balancing review, and the new formula is actually a more higher scrutiny in terms of balancing these things. And I think this is why you said lawyer-like defense. Well, yes, I think at the time, strictly speaking, when in 1980, he was still writing his habilitation thesis. But I think and with hindsight, it is very easy to say, okay, well, this is balancing. Why? And ask the question, why didn't he see that? But knowing Robert, and you know Robert also very well, he was very careful in reading the judgments, and he has all sorts of little booklets with notes and very systematic analysis of these things. But I think it was a bit of a surprise, and as you said correctly, the second occurrence in the case law was quite something later. So at that time, if he realized that, and we don't have evidence, we can ask him, but I don't know whether he remembers or whether this is actually a point. I don't think that this is actually a point. I would say this was developed in a truly parallel fashion. And this is interesting because some people think that he invented all these things and then the court followed. Well, basically, actually the court had all the raw data, and he then delivered the explanation for many of this. And in this, on equality rights, it was slightly different. This is why I mentioned the point. But I think there can be little doubt that this is, so to speak, a truly parallel development, which happens because in some phases, some things, so to speak, hang in the air, and then you have parallel occurrences, and this is, yeah, one thing. Yeah, thank you for this remark, Carsten.
Just something in Spanish. Si el público tiene algunas preguntas, pueden escribirlas en el chat y nosotros hacemos la traducción. Así que no hay ningún problema. Los ponentes están aquí para ustedes y aprovechemos que están aquí. Para cualquier duda que tengan o aclaración, no hay ningún problema. Lo escriben en el chat y Gonzalo y yo hacemos la traducción.
Because I have
I have two questions. One to Carsten. So by the relativity of the discourse, so do you mean the discourse in general or only legal discourse? That means if we consider about the legal discourse, yes, maybe the claim of the law to practice would be some kind of relative according to the legal institutions. But can we say that the general discourse, the general practical discourse, also a relative one? So that is my question. And another question to Professor Brian Biggs, maybe you are still there. So I'm always wondering why it should be separated from two kinds of fields. One is the conceptual analysis of law, and the other is the adjudicative theory of law. So why should we separate these two fields? Is there any analytic reason for that? Oh, okay. That's my two questions.
I think Brian would like to answer, but he says he can't because he's not able to unmute himself. Could you help Brian?
Patricia, ¿podrían ayudar al profesor Brian Biggs? Creo que no puede.
Yeah, there he is.
I'm sorry, I was so busy trying to unmute that I didn't hear the question clearly. Wei Feng, can you please repeat?
Yeah, my question is very simple. That is, it is widespread.
I like simple questions.
Yeah. The question is, why should we separate between two kinds of research? That is, one is the analytic analysis of the concept of law, and the other is the adjudicative theory of law. That means, why should we differentiate between what the law is and what the judge in a concrete case to decide what law is?
Well, one initial point, both Andrew Halpin and Fred Schauer, who recently passed away, both wrote in the last few years saying that one of the problems that John Austin in the 19th century created was that he did this, that he said, I'm going to talk about the nature of law or description of law, and legal reasoning will be a different topic. And that's not, as you indicate, it's by no means obvious. It's by no means self-evident. And Professors Schauer and Halpin both said that, you can divide up the jurisprudential world into people like Dworkin, like the legal realists, to some extent the inclusive legal positivists, who merge how to resolve particular disputes with their nature of the theory of, with their theory of the nature of law, and people like Joseph Raz and Hans Kelsen, who focus on the nature of the theory of the nature of the law, and say that a theory of adjudication is a different topic, and they either have very little to say about it, or in Kelsen's case, if you'll forgive me, what they have to say isn't particularly persuasive. That said, I don't think it's obvious. I don't think, again, that it's self-evident that they should be merged. I think that the theorists, whether it's Radbruch or Alexi or Raz or Dworkin or Shapiro, I think has work to do to show the connections or the lack of connections between.
As refers my question or the question you gave me, yes, there's also relativity in the general practical discourse, maybe even more in the legal discourse, but there's, of course, the same relativity in general practical discourse, because you have this ideal discourse, as Alexi puts it, or the discursive ideal, as I put it, and this is relative. So there's always relativity. You just can't escape it, and you don't have to at all. It's just, well, you have to lower your expectations a bit, what you can reach, and this has, of course, effects on your concept of law if you can find abstract or absolute correctness. But then if you have this general practical discourse and you find your ideas, what you want to have in the law, then you create the law, and then your legal discourse is, of course, relative to what you have created as law. Well, this is, of course, evidently so. But this is not the point in Alexi. Alexi's point is that if you have the legal discourse and you look for correctness, and you have to look for correctness in legal discourse as well, and then you look for this absolute correctness. And the absolute correctness, if you can find it, it should be able to unjustify the law, and then you don't have to follow the law as a judge in the court. But if this is relative correctness, then this is not very convincing. Why should you? Of course, you could say, like Radbruch in 46, you could say, well, we have to follow that what we think to be human rights, and we have had this for centuries. And so this is a good start point and a good starting point, and maybe it is almost as good as objective correctness or absolute justice. But, well, I don't think we can find it.
Any further questions from the public, from the speakers? If not, Gonzalo, what do you think?
May I have use of the time?
Yeah, sure.
I have a small question for Professor Ziegman, because in the whole debate about the optimization requirements and the definitions of principles, I'm thinking it is possible to understand better the structure and the definition of principles if we think about the relationship, the relation between the concept of correctness and balancing. But I'm not sure if it can be a good path for searching. What do you think?
Well, thank you for this question. So it's whether we can understand notion of principles better from the idea of correctness. Well, what does correctness mean? I am sympathetic to critics of Alexi who say that correctness is very general. What does correctness mean? We should do the correct thing. We can't deny it. The problem is Alexi uses correctness in a moral sense, and then it becomes a little bit more difficult. So, I mean, you're certainly right. All is about correctness. We can't evade the idea of correctness. And if we ask what is correct, well, the best thing to do is correct, because if it's the best thing, what else could we do? We should choose better things. So we come to the idea of optimization. We can, I think, develop this idea of optimization starting from the idea of correctness. That's but that doesn't help to explain the idea of principles, because then we have to explain how a conflict of principles is possible, and this is not yet included in the idea of correctness or optimization. Optimization is the demand to do the best thing, but still the question is where to apply it, and we have to apply the idea of optimization to a conflict of principles, but the idea of optimization as such does not explain this idea.
Do you think that it is possible, for example, to introduce an idea or an Aristotelian idea of final cause between principles and correctness in order to understand what principles are? I mean, if you have a regulative idea like correctness, and the principles are the instruments to gain correctness, through this idea you can understand what principles are and why we have to optimize and why they are in conflict sometimes.
Well, of course, the idea of the notion of principles includes the idea of correctness. But what is specific about principles? Well, principles include normative demands, and correctness, if we regarding normative commands, is to fulfill these commands or these demands as far as possible. So we have this relation. We can start with the idea of correctness, and we face the problem of principles. We can say principles include normative demands, and by applying the idea of correctness, we can develop the idea of that we should fulfill principles as far as possible. So then there is a relation. But still, we have to introduce some specific element to explain what is the meaning of, or what the possible notion of principles. We cannot reduce it to the idea of correctness.
I think we're on time, so just let's close this session. Thank you very much for all the speakers, for your time, for all your knowledge, and also for your participation in this book that Alejandro, Claudia, and Gonzalo and me, we worked together. We edited this book and we really love it. So also, I just will say something in Spanish. También a todas las personas del público les agradezco mucho estar aquí con nosotros, y también Alejandro creo que puso el link. Si alguno está interesado en comprar el libro, creo que Juris tiene una buena promoción, así que si están interesados en todas estas ponencias, claro, están en español, no se preocupen, pueden buscarlo en Juris o en otra librería. Muchas gracias.
Bien, antes que nada, bueno, quiero agradecer y felicitar a Gonzalo, a Claudia Toledo, a Alejandro Nava, Arnulfo, Daniel, Mateos, y felicitarlos por haber editado este libro, y a los profesores que han participado, pues agradecerles muchísimo que hayan dado la oportunidad a investigadores, profesores y estudiantes mexicanos de haber escuchado a algunos de los filósofos más importantes a nivel internacional. But finally, I would like to thank and congratulations to Gonzalo, Villa, Claudia Toledo, Alejandro Nava, and Arnulfo Daniel for editing this extraordinary book and for helping us to organize this conference. And especially many thanks to those who have participated in this 12th International Conference of Legal Philosophy of the National University of Mexico for giving the opportunity to make some researchers, professors, and students interested in legal philosophy to listen to some of the leading international philosophers of law. Many, many thanks of all of them.